thanks everyone for coming. I'm so glad to see you all. Some friends, riding mates, others who I know online, and others who I've never met before. Looking forward to getting to know. I'm Steve Vaccaro. I'm an attorney with a firm called Vaccaro Law, and we represent primarily cyclists, also pedestrians struck by motorists, and cyclists who are injured, wipe out on road defects. I've been doing this here in New York City for about 20 years. I'm also very active representing cyclists. And I'll just tell you a little bit about why you might be interested in hearing what I have to say about bikes, which is how I got involved, being a bike lawyer. I've always been riding ever since I was very young, but it was always just for transportation. And I also was politically involved and active in New York City through DSA, staffer for my city council member on the Upper West Side, Ruth Messinger, as a community and labor organizer for many years. But I never really looked at cycling politically. I didn't know that there were organizations like Transportation Alternatives or even bike clubs. I was in my own zone. I like to ride. It was an easy way to get around the city. I took my kids to school by bike. And then in 2004, then Mayor Michael Bloomberg invited the Republican National Convention to New York City. And New York, most people think of it as a Democratic capital D town. And there was a lot of protest activity surrounding that. And it just so turns out that the Republican National Convention was starting on a Friday night, the last Friday night of the month. Now, does anyone here know of any other event that occurs on the last Friday night of the month?
Oh, yeah.
So there's a ride called Critical Mass, which some of you may be familiar with. But at that point, Critical Mass had become quite a force in building our cycling community here in New York City. It was garnering thousands of riders in the fair weather, month after month. And Critical Mass is a monthly group event. Kind of like this beautiful piece of American political tradition where there's no leader, there's no organizer, there's no fixed route, there's no destination. People get together in the same place and the same time, different places in each city. But the last Friday of the month, same place, same time, get together, ride around, and then go home when you feel like it. And this had become incredibly successful and powerful in New York and many, many other cities. So Critical Mass was happening on the eve of the Republican National Convention, and if memory serves, it was great weather. So this was probably the biggest Critical Mass ride we'd ever had here in New York. Conservative estimates were about 6,000 riders. It was probably more like 10,000. You can imagine, you see a group of people riding like this through the streets, thousands of cyclists, you just join with them, so who knows how many people. And that was the problem when the police decided they needed to crack it down because this wasn't respectful of the Republican National Convention to have so many cyclists riding around the city, flagging up the streets. They cordoned off the intersections and kettled cyclists and arrested them by the hundreds. And it was at that point that it came to my attention that New York City was cracking down on cyclists. It's just been I've been like tunnel vision, like I use the bike to get around, I use it for fun with my kids. So I had a number of different lawyers. There were lawyers who had already made a name for themselves and doing great work representing cyclists in New York City at that point, and we joined together and we tried to oppose the NYPD because after that Republican National Convention, NYPD said no more Critical Mass. So they would show up at Union Square, which is where the event convened, and they would come with overwhelming numbers, using all the anti-terror dollars to train officers on how to chase bike-mounted protesters, because I can tell you, police did not have a plan for how to deal with protesters on bikes. So they knew they didn't want to have that happen again. So they crushed Critical Mass by coming out by the hundreds every month after the August 2004 Republican National Convention, until the only people who showed up were like a few people from out of town who wanted to do New York Critical Mass, didn't know that it had been crushed. We brought a lawsuit and seeking injunctive relief to stop the police from their selective harassment against the cyclists. It failed. We had a companion action for damages that got a lot of money for some of those people, but at the end of the day, there was no Critical Mass in New York City. But that brings us to 2008. Oops. And I, as a corporate lawyer, felt, 2008, world financial crisis, it was time to go. So I became a bike lawyer, and that's where you find me now. I am going to try to structure the discussion in a series of 5-minute segments. That was the first one. There are 6 more, and then there'll be question and answer. And just so you know what's coming, how to avoid a crash, what to do in a crash, what can happen after a crash, New York versus New Jersey, riding in the park, and something about riding convivially, which I'll explain what I mean by that at the end. So, how to avoid a crash. Obviously someone can strike you from behind and there's not much you can do, but the critical thing is safety in numbers. And this is why I love group cycling so much. I'm very active with the New York Cycle Club and other cycling organizations. And I love how Rapha understands that as part of the cycling community, they're not just selling you cycling apparel, they're creating this community space, they're organizing community rides, because that's, cyclists can go anywhere in numbers, anywhere. There's no place that's too dangerous for cyclists. If you have a group who are familiar and used to riding them with each other, putting aside, I suppose, interstate highways. And so the critical thing is to ride together, to hold your own on the street, to be more visible to drivers. And if there is a driver who's aggressive or abusive, or in fact hit someone, there's mutual aid. There's other cyclists who can help that person. And those are just some of the reasons why I just adore group cycling. I'm on a little hiatus now, but for years I've been doing rides every Saturday with NYCC. Not trying to lure anyone away from the Rapha Cycle Club, but you should check out NYCC. We have a lot of ride offerings, and it's just another bike club that you can do rides with. But what if you're not going out on a group ride and you just have to get from A to B? You can still reap the benefit of safety in numbers by riding on designated bicycle routes, because you will find that if you go to the designated bike routes, even if it's just signage or painted lanes which don't provide much protection, you will find more cyclists there than you will on other roads. Cyclists seek out the bike lanes, and so you will have a lot of that safety in numbers benefit if you use that infrastructure. And I understand and have seen how bike lanes can present their own dangers. They tend to be towards the margin of the road where the trash isn't collected. There are tire-eating grates. Nowadays they may be full of people on motorized bicycles who may not be going the right direction. There's all sorts of things that lead people to be concerned about bike lanes and whether or not they're safe. Safety in numbers is really key, because if you do get hurt, there will be someone there who will help you more likely than if you're really truly alone. So that's something to keep in mind about safety in numbers. Now, there are 2 main ways that I see people getting hurt. There's all different, every crash is a little bit different, but let's just see. Does anyone here know what's the most common way for a cyclist to get hurt in New York City? Dooring, exactly. Most common. Injuries tend to be less serious, for sure, because you're hitting a stationary object instead of a moving object hitting you. Sometimes you have a little bit of warning and you can stop it. Typically when you're going through the kind of narrow space where you can get doored, you're not going at top speed. So doorings are the most common way to get injured on a bike in New York City. And there's some things that you can do. I've covered them online. I'll just put them out here very quickly. Obviously, stay out of the door zone. You're permitted, when you feel it's unsafe, to ride in the door zone, which is 4 feet out from the side of cars that are either in the parking lane. You can get doored from the traffic lane, by the way, when there's people who are stuck in traffic, they're in an Uber or something, and they decide, I'm out of here, time to go, on foot, and they just throw the door open from the traffic lane. So beware of the dooring hazard from both the parking and the traffic lane. Try to avoid the dooring lane. If you're in it, ride less than 10 miles an hour. I think that if you keep your eyes open and you're aware of what's going on, you're probably not going to get that hurt if you're riding at under 10 and you get doored. You can also ring your bell as you're going through. You can show a light, although it consumes a lot of power. And you can try to look into the cars as you're going through as well, although that's a tricky game, and sometimes it'll distract you from more serious hazards. So that's the most common way people get injured. I will talk now about the most common way people get killed, which is really tragic, and we had way too many fatalities here in New York already this year and over the years. But in my experience, the most commonly fatal motor vehicle crash is what we call a right cross, which is when you have a motorist who is in the rightmost vehicular lane, who assumes that if they're going to turn right, there's nothing to their right they have to worry about except maybe a pedestrian in the crosswalk. But they are not thinking about the possibility of a cyclist on their right who's going straight. And the reason these crashes are fatal is because the vehicle typically goes over the cyclist. It's really horrible. So avoid this happening to you. Do not travel through an intersection alongside a vehicle on the side that the vehicle has a lawful turn. If there's a lawful right turn for the vehicle in the intersection, do not be on the right side of that vehicle. The vehicle operator will not necessarily signal, they will not necessarily see you, and even the most experienced cyclists, maybe messengers have got this down, but most cyclists are surprised at how quickly a turning vehicle comes upon you, especially with its rear wheels. Like you're thinking, I'm alongside the vehicle, here's the vehicle, I'm alongside it. If it turns, I'm going to see it. But what happens when it turns is its rear wheels come up from behind you and you go under them. And this is particularly true in the case with trucks. Most of these fatal right cross cases are with trucks. So just keep your distance and you'll avoid the right cross. Just took out a few notes here. Just trying to see. Okay, so what to do if you actually are in a crash. Hopefully it's not that serious. The paradox here is that if you are in a crash, you're not going to remember anything I'm telling you. Because when you're in a crash, your body automatically releases adrenaline and endorphins and God knows what else. And your judgment is just out the window. People will call me up very sheepishly saying, I was in a crash and I didn't get the driver's license number, or I just went home, or it happens all the time. I was in a crash in 2012, I remember, probably the most serious ever. And I already was doing this work. I knew that I had to stay at the scene, and what I'm about to tell you to do, I felt it was like some kind of science fiction movie with an alien exerting mind control. I wanted to lock up my bike, go to the nearest subway, and go to the place where I knew there were people who cared about me so they could take care of me. And this problem of the victim fleeing the crash scene is magnified whenever you are near your home or near your work or anywhere else where people can help you. You just feel this overwhelming desire to be in that place with those people, and you leave the scene. For so many reasons, it's a mistake to do that unless you're certain you're okay. What you need to do is ID the driver in the vehicle. And oftentimes, a photograph of the license plate in the vehicle isn't enough, because as many of us know, people are driving with fake license plates, obscured license plates, no license plates, and you really can't tell whose vehicle it is. I have a number of cases right now where I'm going after the car dealerships who claim to have sold these vehicles off, because the chain of custody disappears. There's no way to trace the driver of the vehicle. We charge them with negligent entrustment of the vehicle to someone. They can't tell us who it is. You also want to try to ID the driver, because people may not have a license, they may have a suspended license. There may be two people in the car. One was driving, but they switched. One was drunk, and the other one but has a license. The other one was not drunk and doesn't. And then the last thing is you want to get a picture of the whole scene. And this is the thing that people forget to do. You want to show wherever the crash occurred, where the car came to rest, where your bike came to rest, where you were. And really the ideal thing in this scenario is to say to someone else who comes to the scene, is typically in the city, there's someone who's seen it, they've heard it, they come up, they want to help. Say, here's my phone, it's on record. I need you to walk 360 degrees around this crash scene, far enough away so that you can see everything. The car, the driver, me, my bike. That's what you really need in order to prove what happened, because all too often, people will make up stories after a crash occurred about what happened. People who, I make my living questioning under oath, and as a lawyer, presumably I'm good at that because I'm practiced at it. I can tell when people are lying or not. Some people who just come across as so honest, and I just have a feeling almost never lie, feel it's okay to lie about a traffic crash. That is like our American problem, our American condition. People think it's okay, and I'll get into that a little bit about that in a second. But you really want to have your version of events photo recorded to protect yourself. And you need to wait at the scene for the police to take information from the driver, to take your account, unless you're removed to the hospital by ambulance. If you're badly hurt, you need to go to the hospital, get in the ambulance and go. There's no question that's the beginning and the end of what you have to do after a crash if you're that seriously injured. But in most cases, you're not that seriously injured, and you want to make sure that you can prove that it happened. I mean, after the George Floyd killing, a lot of people came to me and said, I was concerned because I was hit by somebody who I thought the police would give a really hard time to if I called the police to the scene. The person was being nice, so I didn't call the police. Well, in New York, you're entitled to free medical coverage paid for by the insurer of the driver. 100%, no co-payments, no deductibles, up to $50,000 for any driver who strikes you. And if that driver flees the scene, you're entitled to $50,000 from a fund that's funded from driver insurance premiums. That money is there. You should never resist going for a trip to the hospital after a crash unless you're sure you're fine. I mean, no one likes going to the ER and waiting with a minor injury. But, medical debt is not a reason not to take an ambulance to the hospital. Absolutely not. It will be paid for by that driver or by this fund if the driver doesn't have insurance or if they flee the scene and can't be identified. You also want to have the opportunity to give your version of events to police. However addled you may be, you still want to be able to give your version, because the driver will say things like, and I've heard these things so many times, like I was just driving along and the cyclist came up and they jumped on my hood. Heard that 3 or 4 times. So just like, oh yeah, that's what they teach us. Once the train wheels came off, okay, next drill. Jump on the hood of the car. Obviously the drivers hit these cyclists and they went up on the hood, but for a driver, they don't get it. They have all these stories about what the crazy cyclist did. You were weaving back and forth and all this stuff. So stay at the scene, don't flee the scene, gather your own evidence. And that's really what you need to do in a crash. And then obviously consult with someone who knows about this stuff. There are a lot of lawyers who do what I do. I mentioned when I started doing this, 2008, 2004, there were plenty of lawyers out there representing cyclists. So I'm not the only one, and we'll all give you a free consultation, explain to you your rights, and you can take it from there. We're not going to pressure you into pretending to be sick or injured. I mean, that's one of the things, being a PI lawyer, about doing this work and representing cyclists. I appreciate, drivers, they're in a metal box, they're wearing seatbelts for the most part, they don't get that seriously injured at urban traffic speeds of 20, 25, 30 miles an hour. Some of them do, but a lot of them, they have litigation disease. They're not really injured the way my clients, the people who come to me, are injured. So it's worth looking into. What to do after a crash? Well, you think all you need to do is get better, right? But it's very interesting to see what's going to happen. A lot of times what happens is that the driver is very nice. They're a human being. They just hit you. It's probably their fault. And they're like, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? Can I take you to the hospital? I've had so many clients who got a ride to the hospital from the driver who struck them. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but what's interesting is that, once they drop you off at the hospital, and maybe they want to stay in touch, and here's my phone number, and you're like out of your head with trauma, so you don't get their identifying information other than the cell phone number, and then they start ghosting you because you're like, well, it turns out I need surgery on my elbow, and well, it turns out my bike, which costs $5,000 or $6,000 is crushed, and I need to know who your insurer is, and they're ghosting you, and you have to hire a private investigator to find them. I've even had sometimes the trail end, cold because someone had a burner phone that they were using while they were doing this sort of thing. So that's something that you want to guard against. Another thing that's happened, and this is the first time I've heard of it. It happened just in November of this year. Woman struck on a bike, brought to the ER by the driver. The driver, seemed very concerned. They exchanged cell phone numbers. I want to make sure you're okay. While the woman's waiting in the ER, she gets a text from Geico. The driver has a Geico app that tells you, do you have the cell phone number of the person you hit? Put it in here. The driver followed the app instructions. So here's Geico now talking to the woman, waiting in the ER to be seen, and the message comes through. I need you to sign this document in order to get you the money. And I saw this text exchange. I wish I had brought it, but I'm on trial tomorrow. I didn't have time to put together visuals for tonight's presentation. But it talks about the money. What do you mean, the money? What money? So this woman, she was pretty young, but she was also out of it because she'd been hit in a crash, and she was just like, oh, okay, I'll fill out the document. It seemed like, as a cyclist, when you get stuck in a crash, you get thrown into these bureaucracies. It's the medical bureaucracy, the legal bureaucracy, the insurance bureaucracy. You didn't sign up for this. If someone comes to you and you're already in receiving instructions mode when you're sitting there in the ER, right? Someone's like, you have to sign this document so we can give you the money. Okay. So she signed a release, signing away all of her rights for $1,000. It was $1,000, and that's the Geico app. That's the Geico crash app. And people talk about ambulance chasers. I mean, they're ahead of the ambulance. She didn't even get in an ambulance, and they were on her getting her signature and release, and we were able to fix it. I just said, this is outrageous, and you're really going to have a problem if you try to hold this woman to this. And at the end of the day, she wasn't that seriously injured, and it was just a little bit more money that she got, and I didn't even handle it. She handled it on her own. But the point here is that this is the sort of thing that can happen to you after a crash. Third thing, this happened to me after a crash in Brooklyn in 2016. And actually, I went down avoiding a pedestrian who was just walked into the bike lane. I had an AC separation in my shoulder, and went to Brooklyn Hospital, went and got my OxyContin. I'm at home chilling the next day, and I get a call. This is from your lawyer's office to set up an appointment with your doctor. I'm like, really? I have a doctor, I have an orthopedist I've been with for years, You're not calling from, Dr. Jobin's office. And who's my lawyer? So as it turns out, this happens quite a bit. EMTs sell the cell phone numbers of the people who they pick up after a crash who've been hurt, and they sell it to PI lawyers. So I was like, I couldn't believe it. And I said, well, I would like to meet with my doctor and my lawyer. When can I meet with my lawyer? No, he's busy, you can't meet with him. But I stuck with it, I was recording these calls, I was recording all the calls, and I was just trying so hard to get a name. What's the name of the lawyer who's my lawyer? And finally they told me. I put all the recordings together on a disc, and I sent it into the disciplinary committee of the Office of Court Administration, and they investigated it, and they said, we went and spoke to that lawyer, and by the way, his name is Boris Linares, so I'll come right out and say, don't go with Boris Linares. And they said, he told us it was an overzealous paralegal in his office. And he had no knowledge that this paralegal was doing this. So, there's nothing we can do. But a lot of people get these calls, and because the person calls in an authoritative manner, I've had clients say, I thought it was a call from the city. They were acting like an official who knew what my next steps were, and they were trying to help me take the next step. So, so you have to be careful, but that isn't a problem with all lawyers who do that sort of work, just some of them. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about New York v. New Jersey because, people really responded to that, right? I did that on Instagram, and I was saying the laws are so different in New York and New Jersey. I want to frame a little bit some of the differences. New York is where motor cars were first introduced in the United States in the late 19th century. And they were injuring and killing people left and right. And we have this incredibly dense city. It is now, it was back then as well. And people were up in arms about it. So we have some of the most protective laws for vulnerable road users, cyclists, and pedestrians in New York than you'll find anywhere in the country. And part of it also is that here's New York City with this great concern about the introduction of the motor vehicles. And New York City has outsized influence within the state in which it's situated. There aren't many states that have one city that's calling the shots for the entire jurisdiction the way New York City sort of does for all of New York State. So we have this great legal regime, and the drivers have to pay for vulnerable road users who get hurt on the road to a significant extent on a no-fault basis and then on an at-fault basis as well. New Jersey, for decades you've had a situation where politicians running for statewide office say, I'm going to deliver to you lower insurance premiums because car insurance is killing everyone and everyone is paying too much to the car insurance companies. So what the politicians did is systematically extinguish the rights of pedestrians and cyclists, who are the ones who suffer the most serious injuries when they're struck. I mean, other drivers, again, they're in a, you might have higher speeds in a suburban context, in a highway context, but the fact is the burden of traffic violence falls most heavily on vulnerable road users, not on other motorists. So saying we're going to make it harder for people to sue after they've been hurt in a motor vehicle collision is really about transferring money from motorists, from the vulnerable road users over to the motorists, because now their insurance premiums come down. So what are the rules that have effectuated this? One of them is the no-fault rule that I just mentioned. In New Jersey, you're presumed to have your own no-fault coverage with your own auto policy. They just assume everyone has an auto policy in New Jersey. I was blown away when I learned this. They didn't teach it to me in law school when I went there in New Jersey, but I learned it starting to do the bike law. So if you don't have your own policy would pay your medical bills if a driver hits you as a cyclist in New Jersey. But if you don't have your own coverage, they have the state fund called the PLIGA, Property Liability Insurance Guarantee Association, and it is like most states have a charity fund like this that will put money towards someone who has an injury, sometimes only catastrophic injuries, and doesn't have auto insurance. PLIGA, I have yet to have a client who went to get money from PLIGA who did not have a private investigator visit them at home and at work. Because in New Jersey, if you don't have your own auto policy, you are presumptively a fraudster, a deadbeat, and someone who should deal with the humiliation and embarrassment of having a private investigator come around your workplace asking questions about you or knocking on your door. It's absolutely outrageous. And the benefits they pay aren't as good as our New York version, which is MVAIC. So that's one of the ways that you are subsidizing a driver in New Jersey with your own life and limb and keeping their rates low, because that driver never has to pay for your medical bills, except in unusual circumstances in New Jersey. What are the other rules that they use to transfer value or benefits away from vulnerable road users to the insurance companies and to the drivers? Well, in New Jersey, you have to have a displaced fracture in order to have a lawsuit at all based on fault. A displaced fracture means that the bones are so far out of whack that most likely you will need surgery with metal hardware inserted in order to put them back into alignment. In New York, a fracture alone will do. In New Jersey, you have to, if it's a soft tissue injury, demonstrate a permanent disability. In New York, a significant, if temporary, disability is sufficient to enable you to maintain a claim against the driver. Much lower bar to being able to bring a lawsuit. In New Jersey, they introduced something under Governor Florio called $1 a day insurance policy. He said, there's all these people who want to drive legally with insurance, but they can't afford it. So let's make it affordable for them. $1 a day, $365 for an auto policy for the year. What does it cover? Well, you have to be eligible for Medicaid. If you're eligible for Medicaid in New Jersey, you're eligible for a $1 a day policy. What does the policy pay you? It covers the portion of your medical expenses that aren't covered by Medicaid, and nothing else. So if you're drunk and driving and you drive into a tree and you're on Medicaid, your $1 a day policy will supplement what Medicaid will pay, and New Jersey doesn't have to pick up the tab. But if you hit someone else, if you hit a cyclist in New Jersey, you have no coverage. And it's legal, it's allowed. Another transfer from cyclists and pedestrians over to motorists. They also just have made it harder to bring a claim in New Jersey. No dooring statute in New Jersey. If you want to convince someone in New Jersey that you were wronged because a driver doored you, well, in New York, you'd have a statute that says don't open the door unsafely, don't open the door into traffic. If you're in New Jersey, it's just like, was it negligent? And you have to go and convince a New Jersey jury that they should make driver pay cyclists for opening the door up into them. And it's really hard. And then they had this crazy rule that the Supreme Court decided in order to keep counties safe from claims of cyclists injured on road defects in shoulders, no cyclists allowed in the shoulders. It's called Polzo v. Essex County. It was a fatal wipeout on a sinkhole, and the court just couldn't imagine the idea that, the county would have to pay any damages towards the cyclist. So they said, well, the way that we read the motor vehicle laws, we, the Supreme Court of New Jersey, we don't think that anyone's supposed to use it. It's not the usable portion of the roadway. So, stay, and they even said in their opinion, we understand why cyclists might want to use the shoulder. It's like, no kidding. But, this is what the law says. Our arms are tied behind our backs. We have to announce what the legislature did, which said that, the shoulder is not the usable portion of the roadway. So we really have a lot of work to do in New Jersey to make it as safe for us in New York who like to ride over there, as well as for the New Jersey cyclists. I want to speak quickly about lap riding in Central Park and other riding in parks here in New York because it's so important. It was a 50-year effort to get the cars out of Central Park. When I first started, 2018 is when we got them out of Central and Prospect Park. First Prospect, and then 6 months later, Prospect Park showed the way. In the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s, a lot of our public spaces were decrepit, poorly maintained. They were known for crime, including violent crime. And it was really cyclists who were the ones who were still using these spaces because we could do so more safely, right? We could, by the time someone knew we were there and a potential target for a crime, we were already almost gone, right? I mean, that's not always true, of course, and there's some bad stories about the Williamsburg Bridge back in the day when people would just knock people off their bikes and steal their bikes, but mostly cyclists were making these areas safer because a lot of people felt uncomfortable and afraid going there alone, and we led the way, our organizations led the way, Transportation Alternatives, the bike clubs. We were very active, and we worked through these organizations for years. I remember there's a group called the Recreation Roundtable in Central Park where we met each month, all the loop users. We had representatives from tri-groups, from Central Park Track Club, bike clubs, Transportation Alternatives. We were all there talking about how do we organize and program the loop so that everyone can enjoy this wonderful, undeveloped land here in such a crowded, dense city. It's so beautiful. And so what we have in Central Park is the product of years of labor by so many people who love our parks and want to keep them as a place for us to enjoy all kinds of recreation. I mean, we have mountain bike trails in some New York City parks. We have cross-country ski trails in Riverside Park. We have a way to program for every activity, but I just want to sound this note of alarm. Ever since the Central Park Conservancy got that $100 million charitable gift, biggest charitable gift ever given in the history of giving, they stopped holding the Recreation Roundtable. They have now hired a consulting agency to solicit opinions about bikes in the park. And if you take this survey, it's an online survey, it's a little bit like a push poll. It's like, do you feel safe, being in the park with cyclists around? They're asking you like these kinds of questions. And I've seen it before. It looks to me like a prelude to pushing cyclists out of the park. And I just say, as the demands on the park increase, we have to recognize, certainly Central Park is an international, global destination. People want to come, the tourists are coming in, and that's where the money comes from. So I'm not going to say no, tourists take second seat. We have to have tourism in New York City. It's absolutely critical. But you can program it properly. You can say cyclists can ride at a certain time of the day. CRCA, many of you may be familiar with, it's the leading riding club here, racing club here in New York City. And they get permits, they have volunteers out in the park who are spotting pedestrians to prevent them from walking to where the cyclists are racing. They have a motorcycle that's pacing the ride and is ringing a cowbell. They have so many steps that they take to make sure that people can race in the park and be safe. And it's 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, right? Why can't Central Park Conservancy and Prospect Park take this money that they've been getting and put it towards volunteers who can help people use and share the loop on the park? So that's my message, and I urge all of you to get involved in every opportunity that you have to try to make a difference in those parks and keep them open to cyclists, because I do fear that we are on the way out. I wanted to just talk a little bit about transportation and communication, or conviviality, right? What's conviviality? I mean, I read a lot of people, of theorists back in college. I said I was interested in politics, and you read people like Murray Bookchin, Ivan Illich. There's a lot of great authors who talk about urbanism from the 60s and the 70s, and they really speak to me, because what I love and what I hope all of you love about living in the city is the density, right? Is that, anything could happen. You could meet anyone, and you do. And somehow it all works. It all works magically. And, traffic is just where we encounter strangers. Traffic is what you find when you go out into public space in a densely populated city. And people talk about traffic as a thing to be managed, driven down, and to try to increase throughput times or whatever else. But really, I think traffic is how we encounter our fellow New Yorkers who we don't know yet. And I also think, and you all know this from road cycling, is that communication is absolutely critical just in order not to get hurt. So, of course, you media eyes with people. You motion people through. You yield to them. You let them know if you're passing them. Not barking out, oh, you're left, whatever. I just say left. I just say left so I know that they can hear me. They might be wearing earphones, but at least I did it, right? I think that, and yielding to someone, I have to say on my daily ride, it's a 10-mile commute from where I live up in Harlem down to my office in Lower Manhattan. Nothing brightens my day more than yielding to someone who really deserves it because they're trying to use the crosswalk. I will also call out people who do the wrong thing. Cyclists, runners, I tell runners, have you tried the running path? When I'm on the Greenway. It takes them like a minute or so, or maybe a few seconds to realize I'm putting them down. But, it's really, this is how we do it in New York. Cops are a blunt instrument. We learned in critical mass that if you tell cops that the cyclists are out of control, they're not going to be able to distinguish the cyclists who are causing problems versus the cyclists who are just out there riding responsibly any more than, they can tell the drivers who are creating a problem versus the ones they just want to ticket as efficiently as they can. If you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And the cyclists who say we need to have more cops in the bike lanes because of the motorized devices, they're as likely to get ticketed as anyone else. And I think in New York, what we have is a tradition of public remonstration, which is just calling out people, not necessarily ruining their day, but just letting them know. And I have this anecdote. I remember riding with my son to school, and he was about 5 years old, and we're going down Central Park West, and we're about to turn right, and I'm about to turn right, and then there's this driver, there's a cyclist who's behind us, and just as I'm about to turn right, they're there. They're right there on the right, and they say, could you signal please? It's a common courtesy. And I felt so stung. I carry that with me to this day. Because I was in front of my son, and I felt so bad. And this was at a time, it must have been like 2002, 2003, and I wasn't a road cyclist. I had never been trained to bicycle, and I just rode around in New York because I had a bike, and that was a way to get around. It didn't cost any money, and it just completely opened my eyes to the fact that you do have to be careful and take some time for other people's safety. Got to be upstanding, do the right thing, and again, there's nothing better than that smile on the person's face when they do it right, and you're like, you slow down, you're like, no, go ahead. It's an act of grace that you will carry with you through that day or even longer. So, I strongly encourage people to ride communicatively. And the last point I want to make before opening up to Q&A is just to say, e-bikes, e-scooters, motorized unicycles, whatever they're going to come up with next in the bike lane. I don't think that we're going to get where we need to go by regulating the technology, because the technology comes in the mail. You click pay, your device comes in the mail, and you start riding. And the police are not our friends. The police don't understand, oh, this one's legal, that one's not, what's its horsepower, what's its maximum speed. Forget it. You're never going to get that out of the police. I don't think it's the technology that we can control or should control, it's the people. It's the people operating the bikes. And I'm telling you, I hope you'll agree with me that it's really the attitude of the people on the bikes, like drivers. Like, they don't see you, they don't expect to be seen, they think they're the fastest one out there, they're riding right up the middle, they're not keeping right, they're not saying I'm passing you or on your left, they're not signaling a turn or a change in line. As far as I'm concerned, people on the motorized devices, if they behave the way we would like to see cyclists behave in the bike infrastructure, it's okay with me. Come on into the bike lane. I have a petition I want you to sign to expand the bike lane so that it's 2 lanes, one for light electric vehicles and another one for pedal cycles. And we can get there when you consider all the things that our cycling movement has done here in New York to improve the cause of cycling. It's incredible. We brought the speed limit down to 25 miles an hour. We have the largest speed camera program in North America. We recriminalized negligent driving by motorists that injure or kill cyclists after it having been decriminalized from the 1950s through the 2010s. I could go on and on and on about all the wonderful things that our cycling community, our safe streets and urbanism community have done here in New York. We can do this too. And we have to do it because there really isn't any other option. Bringing in a bunch of cops to arrest all the illegal e-bikers, it's just not going to work. That's just my opinion. But anyway, thanks so much for listening, and I'd be happy to hear any questions.